My grandfather's thunderous threats silenced the entire neighborhood as that arrogant HOA officer scrambled back over our fence. That power-drunk bureaucrat had no idea he'd just declared war on a retired Navy electrical engineer with 4 decades of experience rigging systems that could drop a man in seconds. When officials abuse their authority and violate your property rights, sometimes only shocking consequences will teach them boundaries. Before this battle ended, one corrupt HOA regime would crumble, while my supposedly harmless 73-year-old grandpa would become a neighborhood legend. I'm still amazed at how perfectly his revenge unfolded. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment if you've ever fantasized about fighting back against HOA tyrants who think your home is their kingdom. I still remember that crisp fall morning when it all began. Grandpa Harry was in his element, tending to his prized tomato vines and the Juliette roses his late wife Martha had loved so dearly. I watched from the kitchen window as he whispered to the blooms as if she were still there. "Look, Martha," he murmured, gloved hands gently pruning a wayward stem. "The flowers are even prettier than last year, aren't they?" He'd been doing this daily ritual since my grandmother passed 5 years ago, and I never had the heart to interrupt. These quiet moments in his garden were sacred to him, a connection to the love of his life and the home they'd built together over 45 years. I was running late for work that morning, hastily throwing files into my briefcase while simultaneously trying to gulp down my coffee. "Grandpa," I called out as I headed toward the back door. "Don't forget about that HOA letter, the one about the apple tree being too tall." He waved dismissively without looking up, his weathered face peaceful in the morning light. "That tree is barely 7 feet tall. It's been there for 20 years. They can take their letter." I cut him off before he could finish that colorful thought. I know, but please, let's not make waves. These new HOA rules are ridiculous, but they can fine us hundreds of dollars. I'm trying to build my reputation in this community, and I don't need problems with the neighborhood dictators. Fresh out of law school with mountains of student debt, I couldn't afford to make enemies in the upper-middle-class suburb where my new small law firm was located. I'll handle it when I get home tonight. Okay. Just as I was about to leave, Rusty, our golden retriever, started barking furiously at the fence line. That dog had an uncanny ability to detect HOA personnel. It was like he could smell bureaucratic overreach. Through the kitchen window, I spotted Trevor Wilson, clipboard in hand, taking photos and making notes outside our fence. Grandpa Harry noticed, too, and straightened up, his peaceful gardening meditation broken. I watched as he approached the fence, Rusty loyally at his heels, still growling low in his throat. "Can I help you with something?" Grandpa called out, his tone polite but firm. Trevor looked up, his expression a mixture of self-importance and disdain that made my stomach knot. "Mr. Sullivan," he replied with exaggerated formality, "your apple tree exceeds the maximum height allowed by the new HOA guidelines. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation with potential fines if not addressed within 7 days." What happened next set everything in motion. Trevor couldn't see clearly to measure the tree from outside the fence, so without asking permission, he simply hoisted himself up and over our 6-foot privacy fence. I gasped as I watched from the window. Just last week, Grandpa had politely but firmly told Trevor, "Next time, you need permission before entering my private property." But apparently, that warning had fallen on deaf ears. Trevor landed with a thud on our side, immediately heading toward the apple tree with his measuring tape, trampling through Grandpa's carefully tended herb garden in the process. "Excuse me." Grandpa's voice took on a steel edge I rarely heard. "You are trespassing on private property. Get off my land right now." Rusty's barking reached a fever pitch. Trevor turned, his face flushed with indignation. "I have the right to access any property in the HOA area if there's a suspected violation. It's in the bylaws you signed when you bought this house." I should have intervened, but something in my grandfather's expression stopped me. I'd seen that look only a few times in my life, a quiet, calculated anger that meant someone had crossed a line they shouldn't have. "Get off my property," Grandpa said again, each word measured and precise. "The next time you want to inspect anything on my land, you call ahead and make an appointment when my grandson is home," Trevor sneered as he made some final notes. "You'll be hearing from the HOA committee, Mr. Sullivan. And I'll be back with full authority." As Trevor climbed back over the fence, I saw Grandpa immediately reach for his phone. He was calling Frank Donovan, his neighbor and friend, who happened to be a retired lawyer. Even from the kitchen, I could hear Frank confirming what I already suspected. Trevor had absolutely no legal right to enter our property without permission, HOA rules or not. By the time I got home that evening, Grandpa was sitting at the kitchen table with a determined look that both worried and intrigued me. I checked the HOA regulations myself and confirmed Trevor had overstepped his authority, literally and figuratively. "If they want war," Grandpa said quietly, "they'll get war." He looked at me with an unexpected vulnerability. Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming like those stubborn old coots I used to complain about. Then his expression hardened again. "But some things are worth fighting for, Andrew. This is our home." He turned to Frank, who had apparently spent the afternoon with him. "Frank, remember what I did at the Lakeside electrical substation? It's time I dug out some old equipment from the shed." The next afternoon, I came home to find Grandpa and Frank hunched over the dining room table, surrounded by what looked like electrical components, wires, and diagrams. Tools were scattered across the normally pristine oak surface, and both men had that gleeful look that only senior citizens planning mischief can truly perfect. "What exactly are you two up to?" I asked, setting down my briefcase and eyeing their project with growing concern. Grandpa looked up with a twinkle in his eye that immediately set off alarm bells in my legal mind. "Just a little home security upgrade," he said innocently, too innocently. He held up what looked like a circuit board and continued explaining a system that only someone who'd repaired electrical substations during blizzards could design. To demonstrate, he touched a tree branch to a test circuit, creating a soft buzz sound as the branch jumped slightly. My legal training immediately kicked into overdrive. "Please tell me you're not electrifying our fence," I said, already envisioning lawsuits, criminal charges, and my fledgling legal career going up in smoke. "That's dangerous, probably illegal, and definitely against HOA regulations." Grandpa chuckled, exchanging a knowing look with Frank. "It's completely legal with proper warning signs," he explained. "And it's not dangerous, just enough of a jolt to make our friend Trevor jump a bit. Nothing that would cause actual harm." Frank, ever the lawyer, even in retirement, nodded in agreement. "I've checked the local ordinances, Andrew. As long as the voltage is low and there are clear warning signs, it falls within the legal limits for deterrent systems, similar to those used by farmers to keep livestock contained." I was about to argue further when I noticed an official-looking envelope on the counter, another letter from the HOA. This one threatened a $500 fine for interfering with an HOA inspector in the performance of his duties. The audacity of it made my blood boil. They were fining us because Grandpa had objected to Trevor illegally trespassing on our property. In that moment, something shifted inside me. All my concerns about not making waves evaporated. After years of burying myself in legal textbooks, I'd forgotten one of the most important lessons my grandparents had taught me. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient. "Okay," I said, surprising even myself with my change of heart. "But we do this properly. Clear warning signs, documentation of everything, and the shock has to be mild enough not to cause injury. And we're setting up security cameras to record everything." The dining room quickly transformed into what Grandpa jokingly called Operation Fence Defense Headquarters. Frank pulled out his old engineering textbooks while Grandpa rummaged through boxes of components he'd stored since retirement. "You never know when these might come in handy," he explained, holding up a voltage regulator that must have been 20 years old, but still in perfect condition. I was amazed at how methodically they worked together, measuring twice, checking calculations, and testing every component. This wasn't just about rigging up a quick deterrent. Grandpa was applying the same exacting standards he'd used when designing systems that protected thousands of lives. Safety first, effectiveness second, and a touch of poetic justice third, he declared, adjusting his reading glasses as he soldered a connection with surprising steadiness for his age. The perfectionism I'd sometimes found frustrating in my childhood now seemed like his greatest strength. We spent the next several hours installing cameras at strategic points around the yard and fence line. As we worked, Grandpa told stories about his time in the Navy where he learned advanced electrical skills while maintaining critical systems on aircraft carriers. You know, he said as he carefully connected wires, there's a fine line between respecting rules and allowing yourself to be bullied. Your grandmother understood that better than anyone. He paused, gazing at the roses in the distance. When the elementary school tried to force us to medicate your father for being too energetic in class, Martha marched down there with research papers and legal precedents. Wouldn't leave until they agreed to try alternative approaches first. He smiled at the memory. They never knew what hit them. While Grandpa and Frank finalized the fence system, I did some legal research of my own. What I discovered was eye-opening. Our HOA had implemented several new rules without following proper voting procedures. They had also been selectively enforcing regulations, primarily targeting older homes while ignoring violations by newer, more expensive properties. As a lawyer, I could see multiple grounds for challenging their authority. I also spoke with several neighbors who shared similar stories of harassment from the current HOA leadership. One neighbor, James, a 23-year-old computer science student, offered to help create a neighborhood chat group for residents frustrated with the HOA. And I can definitely record any confrontations if you need backup, he added enthusiastically. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Donaldson, stopped by during the installation, bringing us homemade lemonade and cookies. I've lived here 32 years, she confided, her voice low, as if Diane might have spies listening. They tried to fine me $300 last month because my mailbox was insufficiently modern according to their new standards. At my age, I can barely afford my medications, let alone a fancy mailbox. She squeezed Grandpa's arm. You show them, Harry. Some of us can't fight back, but we're behind you 100%. Her words reinforced what was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't just about our fence or Grandpa's apple tree. It was about a community being slowly strangled by overreach and possibly corruption. The stakes felt suddenly much higher than a simple boundary dispute. By evening, the system was complete. Grandpa had installed a clear warning sign reading caution, electric fence, for animal control only prominently on the fence. He tested the system one final time with a branch, nodding with satisfaction at the mild, buzzing sound it produced. I recorded the entire setup process on video for legal documentation, making sure to capture the warning signs and the minimal voltage output. As we sat on the back porch afterward, enjoying a well-deserved beer, Grandpa had a look of contentment I hadn't seen in years. Now, he said, taking a slow sip, we wait. And knowing Diane Prescott's personality, we won't have to wait long. Frank nodded in agreement. The HOA queen doesn't like to be challenged. You two have poked the hornet's nest. Despite my lingering concerns, I couldn't help feeling a sense of anticipation. Sometimes, I had to admit, my grandfather's stubborn streak was exactly what a situation called for. 2 days later, just as Grandpa had predicted, Trevor returned. This time he wasn't alone. Diane Prescott, the HOA president herself, stood beside him outside our fence, wearing an expensive blazer that seemed excessive for a neighborhood dispute. Even more interesting was the presence of Gregory Prescott, Diane's husband, watching from a distance beside their luxury SUV, his expression calculating and wary. Rusty alerted us with his now familiar HOA bark, and Grandpa and I exchanged knowing glances before heading to the backyard. I noticed several neighbors casually wandering outside to witness the showdown. Smartphones discreetly ready. James, our young tech-savvy neighbor, had positioned himself on his front porch with an unobstructed view of our yard, his camera already recording. Diane's voice cut through the pleasant afternoon air like a bandsaw. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to discuss multiple violations on your property." She pulled out a list so long it might as well have been a scroll. Beyond the oversized apple tree, we've noted unapproved fence paint color. Grandpa raised an eyebrow at that. The fence had been the same color for 15 years. "Trevor will be conducting an official inspection today," she continued, her tone leaving no room for discussion. Grandpa's response was calm but firm. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Prescott, but as you can see," he gestured to the warning sign, "we've had to install an electric fence recently. If you'd like to schedule an inspection, my granddaughter can be present as our legal representative." Diane's face flushed with anger. "Remove this dangerous fence immediately. This is a direct violation of community standards and a safety hazard." Grandpa shook his head. "Actually, it's completely legal. The voltage is within county regulations for property protection, and as you can see, it's clearly marked with warning signs." He gestured toward our security cameras. "We've documented everything, including Mr. Wilson's unauthorized entry onto our property 2 days ago." Diane's nostrils flared. She turned to Trevor and hissed, "Dear job." The implication was clear. She wanted him to climb over the fence again despite the warning. Trevor hesitated, eyeing the warning sign with visible apprehension. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Diane snapped, "For God's sake, it's probably not even connected to anything. Just go over and check the tree." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I stood behind Grandpa, legal pad in hand, documenting every word of the exchange. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson was watering plants that had already been thoroughly soaked, while Mr. Ramirez suddenly found his front walkway in desperate need of sweeping. Even old Mr. Fitzgerald, who rarely left his house due to mobility issues, had somehow made his way to his front porch with a pair of binoculars he wasn't even pretending were for bird watching. The entire street had become an audience, silently rooting for the underdog in this confrontation between ordinary citizens and overreaching authority. What happened next was both predictable and immensely satisfying. Trevor reluctantly began climbing the fence, and the moment his hand touched the top rail, the system activated. Lights flashed, a warning buzzer sounded, and Trevor received exactly what the sign had promised: a mild electrical shock. It wasn't enough to cause injury, but it was certainly enough to surprise him. He yelped and lost his balance, tumbling backward directly into Juliet's rose bushes, the very ones Grandpa had planted with my grandmother all those years ago. The entire scene was captured not only by our security cameras, but also by at least 5 neighbors' phones. James was grinning ear to ear as he recorded. Trevor scrambled to his feet, his face a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and indignation. "You assaulted an HOA officer?" Diane shrieked, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." A strange silence fell over the neighborhood as everyone waited for Grandpa's response. This was the moment that would define whether we were troublemakers or justified defenders. I held my breath, my legal training screaming at me to intervene. But something told me to let Grandpa handle this his way. His decades of managing crisis situations during his Navy and engineering career had prepared him for confrontations far more intense than this neighborhood dispute. The calm demeanor that had helped him navigate power plant emergencies and military challenges now served him perfectly in this suburban battlefield. Grandpa remained remarkably composed. "Please do," he replied, pointing to our security cameras. "We have the entire incident recorded, including your instruction for him to trespass on clearly marked private property after being denied permission to enter." Diane's face shifted from anger to uncertainty as she realized the legal quicksand she'd just stepped into. Gregory approached then, putting a restraining hand on his wife's arm and whispering something in her ear that made her expression darken further. I caught snippets of their heated exchange, Can't afford this kind of attention right now, the development plans. Before Gregory turned to us with a forced smile. We'll address this at the next HOA meeting, he said smoothly. In the meantime, Mr. Sullivan, I suggest you reconsider your approach to community standards. As they retreated with Trevor limping slightly and plucking rose thorns from his uniform, several neighbors approached to congratulate Grandpa. About time someone stood up to them, Mrs. Henderson from 3 doors down said. They tried to fine me $500 for having a bird feeder last month. Others shared similar stories, painting a picture of an HOA that had become increasingly tyrannical under Diane's leadership. We were still chatting when Grandpa's phone rang. It was Abigail Turner, a relatively new member of the HOA board and local freelance journalist. She wanted to meet privately to discuss concerning developments within the association. After hanging up, Grandpa turned to find Gregory Prescott had lingered behind. Mr. Sullivan, he said quietly, I'd advise you to be careful. My wife isn't one to back down easily. What surprised me most was the shift in the community's energy after this confrontation. Before the fence incident, people hurried into their homes after work, garage doors closing quickly, minimal interaction with neighbors, a suburb of strangers united only by property values. But as twilight fell that evening, people remained outside, talking in clusters on driveways and front lawns. Children played on the street without parents anxiously calling them inside. Several neighbors brought folding chairs onto their lawns, sipping wine and exchanging stories of HOA overreach. Mrs. Ramirez appeared with a tray of homemade empanadas she insisted on sharing with everyone. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates felt like a community rather than a collection of expensive homes. Something had awakened in our neighborhood, a collective spirit of resistance against petty tyranny that had been dormant for too long. As the crowd dispersed, Frank arrived, having heard about the confrontation through the neighborhood grapevine. Diane isn't going to let this go, Harry, he warned as we settled on the porch. I have a buddy who works at City Hall. He says Gregory Prescott has filed for building permits for a major project right here in our neighborhood. I think you've just become an obstacle to something much bigger than an apple tree or a fence. Grandpa frowned, connecting dots that weren't yet clear to me. What kind of building permits? Frank's expression was grim. Commercial zoning requests for several adjacent properties. I don't have all the details yet, but it sounds like the Prescotts have plans that go well beyond enforcing HOA regulations. The full implications didn't hit me until later that evening when I realized our modest family home might be standing in the way of someone's multi-million-dollar development plans. The next afternoon, Abigail Turner arrived at our door, a woman in her early 40s with a journalist's observant eyes. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before entering our home. Once seated at our kitchen table with coffee, she got straight to the point. What I'm about to share could cost me my position on the board, she began, pulling out a folder. But it's the right thing to do. Inside were emails, financial records, and meeting minutes that painted a disturbing picture. Gregory Prescott, through his development company, had been quietly purchasing homes in our neighborhood. His ultimate goal, to build a mini commercial complex that would require at least 5 adjacent properties, including the exact plot where our house stood. Dan has been using the HOA as a pressure tool, Abigail explained. She targets homeowners who refuse to sell, especially long-term residents with emotional attachments to their homes. The evidence was damning. Several residents had sold their homes below market value after being subjected to relentless fines and harassment. Diane had been using the HOA's price adjustment authority, a power meant to maintain neighborhood property values, to artificially depress the value of homes the Prescotts wanted to acquire. This email is the smoking gun, Abigail said, pointing to an internal message from Diane to her inner circle on the board. It explicitly discussed clearing out undesirable elements before the Phase 1 groundbreaking. Mid-conversation, an electronic notification arrived. An emergency HOA meeting had been called for Friday with an agenda item ominously titled Enforcement Measures for Safety Hazards. I immediately began preparing a legal strategy, identifying multiple violations of HOA bylaws and potentially state laws. The selective enforcement alone is grounds for a lawsuit, I explained to Grandpa and Abigail, not to mention the conflicts of interest. They never properly voted on most of these new regulations, and the board members pushing them through all have financial ties to Gregory's development company. Grandpa listened quietly, his expression darkening. So this isn't about an apple tree. I remember sitting on the back porch with Grandpa one evening after everything had finally calmed down. He was gazing at Martha's roses, the ones he'd tended every day since she passed, as if they still held her spirit within their petals. The neighborhood had changed so much in such a short time, not just because of what happened with the fence or the HOA, but because something deeper had shifted. People were talking to each other again. Kids played outside until dark without parents worrying about them. It felt like a real community once more. We weren't just defending our home anymore, we had uncovered something much bigger than ourselves. Diane and Gregory Prescott hadn't just been trying to push us out over an apple tree or a fence. They were part of a larger scheme, a calculated effort to reshape the neighborhood by squeezing out longtime residents, especially those who couldn't afford legal battles or fines. And they were doing it under the guise of an HOA, using fear, bureaucracy, and manipulation to get their way. What struck me most was how methodically Abigail Turner had laid out the evidence. She had risked her position on the board to expose the corruption, bringing documents that showed how Diane had abused the HOA's price adjustment authority to artificially lower property values for homes the Prescotts wanted to buy. Elderly residents on fixed incomes were targeted with excessive fines. Young families received citations for things like having playsets or hosting birthday parties. Meanwhile, properties already owned by Prescott shell companies mysteriously got waivers for the same violations. It wasn't just unfair enforcement, it was social engineering masked as neighborhood improvement. And the financial records? They told an even darker story. Thousands of dollars from the HOA budget had gone to a consulting firm called Maplewood Community Solutions, a company registered to Diane's sister, who didn't even live in the state. There was no transparency, no oversight. Just a web of deception built to funnel money where it could disappear unnoticed. The emergency meeting was packed. Word had spread fast about the electric fence incident, and people who had never attended an HOA meeting before now filled the community center. Some came out of curiosity. Others, like Mrs. Donaldson, came because they knew firsthand what Diane was capable of. Trevor tried to play the victim, dramatically describing his fall into the rose bushes as some kind of near-death experience. But many in the room had seen the video, and it was hard to take him seriously when he looked more embarrassed than injured. Diane proposed a new rule that would ban all electric fences with a $100 a day fine for noncompliance. The intention was obvious: either remove our system and leave ourselves vulnerable, or be buried under fines until we had no choice but to sell. But Grandpa had other plans. He stood up and calmly presented the evidence of Trevor's trespassing and our legal right to secure our property. Frank backed him up with local ordinance references, and when Abigail questioned the lack of financial transparency, Diane lost her composure completely. She lashed out at Abigail, practically telling her to move if she didn't like the rules. That moment cracked open the illusion of control Diane had worked so hard to maintain. Despite the resistance from Diane's loyal faction, the vote passed. We had 48 hours to remove the fence or face escalating penalties, but Grandpa had already started thinking about phase 2. That night, we dismantled the electric system and replaced it with something entirely different. No electricity. No alarms. Just a slick silicone coating on the rails, motion-triggered spotlights, and a camera setup James helped install. Grandpa called it Phase 2. I called it genius. When Diane and Trevor returned the next morning to inspect compliance, Trevor made the mistake of climbing the fence again. This time, he slipped, landed flat on his backside, and was bathed in bright light for the entire neighborhood to see. Neighbors burst into applause. Phones recorded every second. James posted the footage almost immediately, tagging it with #SlickFenceJustice. Even the police couldn't argue with what happened. The fence was legal. The warning signs were clear. Trevor had assumed the risk. Diane ranted about sabotage, but by then, even the officers seemed amused. Then came Officer Rodriguez, who stayed behind after the others left. He quietly handed me his card and told me the county prosecutor was looking into several complaints about HOAs in the area, including ours. If we found any solid proof of selective enforcement or financial misconduct, he said, we should call him directly. That's when things really started to unravel for the Prescotts. Grandpa noticed a strange chemical smell coming from the recently sold property behind ours. His Navy experience told him it was industrial solvent, the kind used in heavy manufacturing. Highly toxic and definitely not something you find in a residential neighborhood. We went through the financial records again and found more payments going to Prescott Development subsidiaries. At the same time, Grandpa confirmed his suspicions about the chemical odor. Something illegal was happening behind our house, and we had the evidence to prove it. The city inspector showed up a few days later, responding to Diane's complaint about safety hazards on our property. Grandpa cooperated fully and even led the inspector to the neighboring lot, where workers were dumping waste material into a hidden hole. The inspector took samples, called in environmental officials, and stopped the activity immediately. One of the workers panicked and admitted they had been illegally disposing of materials at multiple sites. When Gregory arrived and realized what was happening, he completely lost it. In his rage, he let slip the entire plan, how they needed 5 adjacent properties, including ours, for a commercial development. He even admitted frustration with Diane's approach, saying they could have made us a better offer if she hadn't been so aggressive. We recorded everything. Frank wasted no time contacting journalists, and soon the local news picked up the story. James released a full timeline of events online, showing how the HOA had been weaponized against residents. Environmental investigators expanded their probe to other Prescott-owned properties, finding similar violations everywhere. The final showdown came at another emergency HOA meeting, this time to vote on expelling our family. But Grandpa had one last trick up his sleeve. Earlier that week, he had set up a fake fence, complete with flashing lights and buzzing sounds, but no actual electricity, to see who might try to tamper with it. Sure enough, Trevor and Diane were caught on camera trying to sabotage it the night before the meeting. Gregory waited nervously in the car, clearly aware of how far they had gone. During the meeting, the city environmental inspector arrived with police officers and announced the discovery of illegal waste disposal tied directly to Gregory's signature. Grandpa explained how his Navy background helped him identify the chemicals. Then, the security footage of Diane and Trevor attempting to damage our property was played for everyone to see. Gregory was taken aside for questioning. Diane tried to defend him, but only dug herself deeper. In a desperate attempt to save face, she blurted out that Gregory was nearly bankrupt after a failed Florida investment, confirming everything we suspected. Abigail was named interim chairperson and immediately began working on reforming the HOA. Diane and Gregory left the neighborhood shortly after. Their house sold quickly, at a steep discount. Trevor ended up working as a gardener in the neighborhood, a job Gregory had cut to save costs. He waved politely to Grandpa whenever he passed, always using the gate instead of the fence. A month later, the neighborhood had changed. HOA rules were relaxed. The commercial development was canceled. A community garden was planted on one of the cleaned-up lots. And Grandpa? He sat in his garden, eating an apple from his too-tall tree, smiling as neighbors gathered around him. He had become a legend, not just for the clever fence or the electric surprise, but for standing up to power and reminding everyone what a real community looks like. Maybe it wasn't his last battle either. A letter had arrived from a nearby neighborhood asking for help with their own HOA troubles. Grandpa chuckled, eyes twinkling. Oh, I've still got a few tricks up my sleeve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Painting the sky in pink and gold, I realized what Grandpa had truly defended wasn't just our home or our property rights. He had fought for dignity, fairness, and the soul of the neighborhood itself, the very thing that makes a place feel like home. Some boundaries are worth protecting, no matter how high the fence may need to be.